Welcome back to Intellectual Potluck, and since today is May Day, that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be looking at the origins of May Day. So May the 1st, or the first Monday of May, is one of those really interesting dates where a lot of different historical things overlap each other, and it's had sentimental meaning for a very long time, but for very different reasons. It originally started out with flower crowns and bonfires and maypoles, and now it's progressed into being a political day about the labouring and working classes. So while today might pass by quite quietly in some places and in some others, it's a public holiday that doesn't necessarily carry a lot of sentimental meaning. For a long time, it was very significant and a day that people held very close to their hearts for a very long time. It was for a while one of the most important days of the year, marking the coming of summer in the Northern Hemisphere and the end of the struggles that come with winter. And now, of course, for supporting workers who are fighting for their rights. So let's have a look at both sides of this coin and how we've got to where we are today. So in pre-modern and agrarian societies, the changing of the seasons was a key factor that came into people's survival and the quality of life that they could live. And the start of May is generally considered to be that line in the sand where the days are getting warmer and people can finally start doing things like planting crops, allow livestock to graze freely. And also being spring, it's the season of new life. You've got lots of little baby animals being born and all of that really cool stuff in the natural world. So for a very long time, a lot of different cultures celebrated this changing of the seasons. And it wasn't necessarily on the 1st of May or even the first Monday of May like we do now, but somewhere around that time. In Celtic, Germanic, Roman, and Norse traditions, the 1st of May or thereabouts was traditionally known as a cross-quarter day, meaning it falls roughly halfway between the spring equinox and the summer solstice. To ancient people, this is a very magical time, so you're celebrating light and warmth and life over death. So across all of Europe, May the 1st became an ancient pagan festival to celebrate this changing of the seasons. There were actually two big pagan festivals that I know of around that time, but the first one we're going to look at is Beltane. And I just want to point out here that for those of us who are in the southern hemisphere, the seasons are obviously flipped. May doesn't have the same seasonal significance as it does in the northern hemisphere. So this is going to largely be about the northern hemisphere. In the southern hemisphere, this same seasonal change would be seen around October. But because Beltane was a Northern Hemisphere festival, it's celebrated on the 30th of April to the 1st of May. It's like an overnight celebration. And the name is believed to have come from Bel's fire, Bel being a Celtic solar deity who is associated with light and healing and fire. So Beltane's customs traditionally centered around big bonfires being lit in villages, community coming together. You would even have couples and newlyweds trying to jump over the flames to encourage fertility and good fortune in their relationship. And of course, it was also a time where offerings were made to some of the spirits. So flowers, milk, food, these were offered to the fairies and spirits associated with nature and fertility. So this was a very big festival, a very rural festival, bringing communities together and trying to prepare for a positive spring, particularly in like a farming community, and celebrating life. So the other pagan festival that I can think of is one from the Roman Empire known as Florali. And so this was celebrated between April 23rd and May 3rd. So again, around that same period, but not exactly on the start of May. And it was an ancient Roman festival to celebrate the goddess Flora, who is the deity associated with spring, flowers, and fertility. I guess the main difference between this festival and Beltane was Beltane had a lot of fire, like very centered around the bonfires, whereas this festival was more about flowers and nature. So there would be a lot of decorations of flowers and greenery. People would wear very bright colors, and quite often people would have like a crown of flowers and things like that. But they'd also have like circus-like performances and games. It was a very big, very jubilant festival. But the underlying theme of both of these is largely the same. It's all about spring, it's all about nature, it's all about life. So this is traditionally what this time of year is known for. And in some Celtic cultures as well, this changing of the seasons is also seen as the time where the spiritual and, I guess, human world, the barrier between them is weaker. So spirits were thought to be extra active at this time, which is why extra offerings were made and communities were trying to win favour with these spirits. But of course, as time goes on, the meaning of these days change, and a lot of that does centre around religion. So during the medieval period, Christianity began to spread way across Europe. And from about the 4th century onwards, a lot of traditional pagan festivals were reinvented or, I guess, absorbed rather than just being outrightly banned. And May Day was among these things. So while Beltane and Floralia were no longer formally celebrated, rural communities would still continue with seasonal customs and have these seasonal traditions, but it wouldn't be directed towards a particular deity. You saw things being introduced such as like the Maypole and the May Queen, but these were all now folk traditions rather than religious practices. And look, for most medieval villages, May Day was still a huge point of celebration. It was filled with joy and dancing and celebrating everything that nature is bringing them or has brought them, and it gave people a well-earned break from the hard agricultural labour, because around this time, it would be even more backbreaking than at other times of year. And celebrations would typically last all day. You'd have dancing around the Maypole, Morris dancing, and these traditions became so important in communities that relied so much on the seasons for their way of life. So rural communities who, if you have a bad season, it can create a bad harvest and then have all kinds of knock-on effects for you. This was a day where people could just celebrate and not have to worry about it. However, as we so often see, during the medieval and early modern period, things started to get more and more influenced by the church. And despite May Day no longer being an actual pagan festival, they still felt a bit insecure about it because that's where its origins had come from. And generally the church was quite conflicted about May Day and whether or not they should allow it to continue. On the one hand, it didn't explicitly go against anything that Christianity was promoting, but its pagan undertones and focus on nature and celebrating and worshipping nature did conflict with a lot of the church's agenda. They also didn't necessarily agree with some of the more sexual themes that were implied in some of May Day's customs. For example, the Maypole was often interpreted as a phallic symbol to represent fertility, and obviously the whole day had its origins around fertility as a central theme. And there was also a custom of young people disappearing into the woods to get up to shenanigans, which wasn't particularly subtle. So the church wasn't a big fan of May Day, wasn't about to come outright and ban it though. However, during the 16th and 17th century, Puritans and other reformist groups in England did come out and express that they thought May Day was a problem. They thought it was immoral and a heathen superstition. This Puritan influence over the church and over England itself really reached its peak in the 1640s. So there had been a lot of tension building between King Charles I, who was the monarch at the time, and the Parliament. And it had been building for a very long time. And, generally they weren't happy with, the royal authority, taxes, and also, crucially, religion. There was a lot of religious conflict. And what ultimately happened was King Charles I, following lots of mounting pressure, fled England, and the English Civil War broke out. So the royalists, who were supporters of the king, were fighting the parliamentarians, who were generally anti-monarchy, but were also becoming more and more dominated by Puritan factions. For anyone who's unsure on who the Puritans were, I'll include some links below, but what you really need to know is that they're a very strict, reform-minded Protestant group who believed that the Church of England was retaining too many Catholic and, popish traditions. So they wanted to purify the church, hence the name. And by that measure, purify society as a whole by eliminating anything that they saw as immoral or frivolous. So as the Civil War went on, Parliament became more and more dominated by the Puritans and also the people who sympathised with the Puritans. And of course, with King Charles having fled the country, Parliament had to take over. They took over control. And so with Parliament becoming more and more Puritan, you ended up with a very Puritan-led country. And so this opportunity was seized to start legislating their moral views and get rid of some of the things that they disagreed with, and May Day was among these things. So they officially banned Maypole dancing and also a lot of other traditional festivals. And look, this is a really interesting part of British history. I really recommend reading up about it because it's really kooky and really really interesting. Yeah, the government in this time, they banned so many things. They literally banned Christmas and colourful clothing for women, and they banned a lot of sports. It was wild. It was a fascinating time in hindsight. I'm sure very, very sucky to live in. Banning May Day probably didn't even make it onto most people's radar. But yeah, it's a really interesting period of British history. I strongly recommend going to read up about it, and I'll include some links below. But coming back to May Day, despite the ban, May Day did carry on in a lot of communities, particularly rural communities where it meant so much more, and also rural communities are generally a bit less regulated. So I would never say that May Day completely died out. After the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, King Charles II came in because King Charles I had been tried for treason and unalived. So we're at King Charles II now. And he encouraged the return of a lot of festivals and a lot of traditions that had been banned by the Puritans. So you saw the return of a lot of Maypoles, and there was a really famous one in the Strand, which was 134 feet tall. And so I think it was really to celebrate not just all of the traditional things that May Day was celebrating, but also the return of the monarchy and winning back this part of culture. I don't think the festival ever fully went back to its former glory, but the symbolism of it and the people who fought to keep it alive meant that it did remain a very, very powerful day. And some future monarchs also did take the effort to make it a focal point. So Queen Elizabeth I, she held an elaborate May Day celebration in her court. But of course, time goes on, Europe becomes to urbanize and industrialize, and so a lot of traditional festivities like that did begin to fade into the background, particularly in the big towns and cities. These folk traditions survived best in the more isolated rural communities, where tradition and, the rhythm of farming life was still so much more significant. But I mean, we do see as well, even in urbanized spaces, it is still seen as a time of nostalgia for a lot of people. And during the 19th century, there were a lot of poets and folklorists who make reference to May Day and these traditional celebrations in kind of, a romanticized way. So we can see that May Day as a whole has had a lot of ups and downs and a lot of changes to its meaning, but has generally stayed within the central themes of being around farming, around nature, and sex and fertility. So this is where we come to the biggest change in May Day and how it became what we know of it as today with International Workers' Day. So as I mentioned before, the world had changed and the Industrial Revolution completely transformed the societies and economies of not just Europe, but, North America. And I mean, most places in the world, to be honest, everywhere was becoming more industrialized. People were moving from rural farms to urban factories. And what they found when they made this shift was that work was becoming more and more mechanized, exploitative, and unsafe. The demands on the everyday person were just increasing and increasing all the time, and there were very few rules to govern what was and wasn't reasonable to ask of people. So for example, some people were working 10 to 16-hour days. You had child labor. There's pretty much no safety regulations, no sick leave, no job security, nothing like that. And so the workers wanted to take some power into their own hands, and they started forming trade unions and socialist groups. These groups were then asking for things like shorter working hours, safer conditions, and to be paid a real living wage that they could actually survive on. So really, the bare minimum, as we'd see it nowadays, but really radical thinking for some of those power-hungry factory owners. And so initially, all of this stuff going on with the workers had absolutely nothing to do with May the 1st, and was completely separate. But then there was the Haymarket Affair, which took place in Chicago in 1886. So on May the 1st of 1886, there was a nationwide mass strike in the US. And it was led by the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions. So hundreds and thousands of people walked off their jobs. And in particularly big cities like Chicago, this was a really significant thing. And these people, their main demand was an 8-hour workday. And so this walkout ultimately led to a demonstration on May the 4th in Haymarket Square in Chicago. And this was originally a peaceful protest. There were speeches, everyone was meeting together. But what ultimately happened was an unknown person threw a bomb into the crowd. It's thought that they were aiming for the police. And the result was that after the bomb was thrown, the police opened fire and several people, including officers and civilians, were killed. In the aftermath of this, 8 people were arrested and blamed for the bombing. Some of the connections were questionable, but ultimately all 8 of them were found guilty. 7 of them were sentenced to death by hanging, although ultimately, after appeals and whatever else, only 4 ended up being hanged. I say only 4, that's quite a lot of people to be hanged, but you know my point, it's half of who they'd originally convicted. But what happened was these 4 people then became martyrs for the cause, for the labour unions. In the immediate aftermath of this incident, there was a huge anti-union clampdown, primarily in the US, but the ripples of it were felt worldwide. And employers were really fighting to regain control of their workforces and bring back the traditional work days that they'd been doing up until then. But what it created was this us versus them mentality, and this tactic really, really blew up in their faces because it just solidified the resolve and the collective consciousness of the labour movement. In 1888, the union decided that it was going to campaign for shorter working days again, and they chose May 1st of 1890 as the day that they were going to do this. And so this was the agreed upon date that the workers would strike. And before it happened, so that was scheduled for 1890, and in 1889, the American Federation of Labor president, he wrote to the First Congress of the Second International, and he informed them of their plans to do this mass strike. And he proposed that this could become an international thing, and that everyone could strike and campaign for an 8-hour workday. And the International adopted the idea. They also decided that on May 1st of 1890, they were going to get as many places as possible to strike on this date in protest for this 8-hour work week that they were pushing for, but also to honour the memory of the Haymarket martyrs and the workers who had been killed in association with the original protests. So Haymarket had become this symbol for working class resistance. And by association, May 1st had become a day associated with, the fight for social justice and also the right to protest. So 1890 marked the first International Workers' Day, and it was seen as a resounding success. And by the early 20th century, May Day was celebrated across a lot of countries, particularly in Europe, Latin America, and in the Soviet sphere, which did cause some issues that I'll get to in a bit. In these countries, this day was commemorated with marches and speeches and demonstrations. So it became more than just a day, it became a stage for these political theatrics. You've got mass parades of workers and unions and leftist parties coming out, speeches from labour leaders and revolutionaries, and, clashes with the police and authoritarian regimes during times where things were very tense politically. So let's circle back to that Soviet sphere tension that I mentioned. Unsurprisingly, in Russia, May Day really took off and took major significance after the Bolshevik Revolution. The Soviet Union turned it into a national holiday, and there were huge military parades in Red Square. It became a symbol of international socialism and communist power. But this connection to socialism and communism is also why some countries don't now celebrate International Workers' Day on May 1st and have chosen to move the day. And I believe the United States started this trend, so not only were they wanting to distance themselves from the communist socialist agenda, but they also wanted to distance themselves from the radicalism associated with the Haymarket incident. So in 1894, they decided that they were going to celebrate Labor Day in September instead. And the idea was still to honour workers without celebrating the martyrdom and invoking revolutionary ideas. And similarly, in countries like Australia and Canada, Labor Day is also celebrated at different times. Australia's a bit of a weird one, as always. So the states don't agree on what day they celebrate Labor Day. Here in Queensland, we celebrate it on the first Monday of May. But in other states like New South Wales, they celebrate it in October. So they didn't even match what the Americans have done. They've just gone different day. I don't know. Australia loves a public holiday, but they don't tend to agree on what they're for. It's weird here, and the states like to disagree. I don't know. But like I say, some of the states still do it on May 1st, and many other countries like the UK, France, Germany, Spain, China, Cuba, Brazil, they still celebrate the first Monday of May or May 1st as the official workers' holiday. In some countries, it's a major public holiday where you do have union-led marches and things. In others, it has faded to the background a bit, and it's either merged with some of the more traditional springtime festivities, or it's just kind of a thing in the back of people's minds. And in the countries that do use May Day as, I guess, more of a political statement, you have seen these marches be used for more broad causes. So you've got climate justice and immigration, anti-globalization and feminism. All of these things have done marches on Labor Day because it's a time for protest and it's a time for speaking out about things that are seen as inequities or trying to broadcast an issue. So the spirit of May Day or Labor Day, whatever people call it, it's continuing to grow and evolve, but it still remains a day with a lot of power and significance for a lot of different reasons. So it's a very multifaceted day. You know, you got the seasonal, the spiritual, and the political sides to it. Yeah, it's starting out as this spiritual checkpoint, marking the midpoint between spring and summer, and it being a festival of hope and sensuality and life, to then, you know, the age of the kings and the conflict and Christianity. But that urge to celebrate and gather and dance, it never went away. May Day carried on, just not celebrating deities or in a religious context, in, you know, village greens and rural communities. And then you've got the final side to it where the world industrialized and so many people's lives changed. And it's created this spark of protest and political struggle. And May Day has become that symbol for solidarity and justice and dignity. And I think there's still some common themes that go through all of these. So you've got the celebrating of life and the workers who want to preserve their rights to life and also have some work-life balance, but also the fight against control. So you originally have people who are fighting against winter and all of the restraints that that puts on them, and to now people fighting against the grind of capitalism. So that's a rundown on how this day has evolved. And yeah, I think it's pretty wild that everyone just chose the start of May to be the start of everything. And yeah, I think it's really cool. And however you celebrate May Day, I hope that this maybe gives you a second to just think about all of the different things that this date has meant for people, because it's really cool how it's connected us all through time. And so that's it from me, and thank you so much to everyone who has listened or watched. Yeah, I hope you join me next time. I have a lot more of these history deep dives planned and in the pipeline, so yeah, I hope that you'll join me. Bye!